Bulford, former RCMP intelligence officer and sniper who served for over 15 years, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's security team.
My dad was an RCMP officer for 38 years, and he just loved catching bad guys.
Yeah.
And so that's what he spent his career doing. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so I just asked for Whitehorse, Dawson City, Watson Lake. And I ended up going to Whitehorse right out of the gate. And that's how I kind of started to learn about what ERT was. Ultimately, I saw what I believe to be a multitude of criminal offenses being committed by our government, by our public health officials, and nobody in law enforcement was doing anything about it. And so my goal, the goal of us writing that letter to the commissioner, and then we wrote one to the attorney general, then another one as like a Hail Mary pass to the governor general. Of course, we got no response from anybody. Naively, I was expecting some like tidal wave of like cops being like, this is bullshit. Like, you can't do this to people. And it didn't. By November, I had made the decision to resign, told my boss, did all the paperwork for my resignation. December 15th, I officially resigned. Me and my wife were like, okay, you know what? Let's just hang out Christmas as a family, and then we're gonna start getting our house ready to sell because we don't want to live in this community anymore.
So Daniel Bulford, former RCMP intelligence officer and sniper who served for over 15 years, including for the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's security team. Resigning in December 2021 due to disagreements over COVID-19 vaccine mandates, Bulford became a key figure in the 2022 Canadian convoy protest, acting as head of security and spokesperson. His active role in the protest and views on public health policies led to his testimony in a public inquiry into the National Emergencies Order, and his career reflects a blend of law engagement experiences and activism. So, kind of rough overview, but I wanted to there's a little bit more to it because, a lot of people I know kind of look up to you and have a large level of respect. And I know sometimes that could be awkward to hear from people. So I thought I'd put something together to try and kind of highlight some of those qualities as to why somebody would have, I think, a level of respect for a person when they are speaking on maybe a belief or integrity that they feel is a principle that they base themselves from. Because qualities of first responders, for an example, that have a high standard of moral code and professionalism, all kind of give a mental image to people that when you say something like a military or RCMP, there's words like honor, professionalism, self-control, courage, sacrifice, patriotism, citizenship, integrity, and commitment are qualities of character and code of conduct, resilience, a standard against unethical practices. These are all, I think, coin phrases you can use for somebody that, is in that form of position. And when you hold yourself, I think your demeanor and how you hold yourself, your presentation and how you kind of hold yourself accountable, those are, I think, a lot of the traits that shine through. And so it holds a lot of weight when you make a decision, for or against something. And I think why a lot of people have a lot of respect when somebody does something that is extraordinarily difficult, at any given time, because that's speaking to some of the qualities that I just kind of outlined here. And I think sometimes you don't realize that when you're that person. So to be on the receiving end of it, it could feel awkward, but I think that speaks to why people, are expressing gratitude, and a level of respect for a lot of what you did, which we're going to get into a lot more here. But I wanted to kind of throw that out there as a baseline, because I think as the story progresses, a lot of those attributes, are going to start showing through, not just talk, but at the end of the day, action. And it puts things into perspective a little bit different.
No, well, thank you. I'm flattered.
Well, one other person that I think, indirectly but not directly kind of falls into that is, because of the political thread, is Jody Wilson-Raybould. And I say that because I think she needs more of a shout out than I think she got when it came to the position she was in at that time. It was relatively lonely, I'm sure. And she's kind of faded off, and SNC-Lavalin isn't a scandal that's really on the radar as much anymore. But, she lost a lot in that whole process, based off of, I think, moral and point of integrity that wildly underestimated. So one other thing, I guess, is I guess not one other thing. That was something I wanted to mention, but to kind of get things kind of going, serving is more or less in the family, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yes. So it started, well, maybe some short-term military service in more distance, but my dad was an RCMP officer for 38 years. And while he was still active, my older brother Ryan joined the RCMP, and then myself and my older brother Sean, we both joined right around the same time. We were like 1 week apart in training. Ryan was 2 or 2.5 years ahead of us. And my older sister Monica has been a long time civilian employee for the RCMP in Grand Prairie.
Oh, yeah, really?
For like 20 plus years.
Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Grand Prairie. That's just a shot away from where we are now.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Right.
It's crazy how many people are kind of related to this area, indirectly or like through family. So, like serving, and especially with it kind of being within the family, what kind of sense of pride or fulfillment were you able to get out of being in that role, that position?
Well, my view on things has changed this last few years, but initially it was very meaningful, right? Like I still look up to my dad. He's a good, solid, strong man of great, principles and honesty and integrity, always willing to help people. He probably spends more time helping people than he does doing his own, taking care of his own responsibilities.
Yeah.
But he's strong, honest, loving, dependable, loyal. Like he's everything that you would want in a father. And, he was one of those cops that he had the experience and the knowledge to climb the ranks if he really wanted to, but he just loved catching bad guys. Yeah. And so that's what he spent his career doing. And so that's what I wanted to do. Initially, I mean, I would say probably all of us would be considered, like if you were to speak to former colleagues, well, especially pre-COVID mandates.
Yeah.
You'd probably, I'm sure if you spoke to anyone who worked with any one of us, we would at the very least be called like very hardworking and competent.
For sure. No, those are definitely, I guess I could almost included that in those character traits. Good night.
So initially because like we were discussing earlier before we started filming, I like to be outside and I like to be very physical. And so I was gravitating more towards the military because I thought I wanted to be a soldier. And I probably would have gone that route if I was single at the time, but I was already with my my wife. And she wasn't crazy about that idea. And I don't blame her. She didn't want to be married to someone who's gone for 6 months to a year at a time.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
So I joined the police instead. And I think, if I remember, I think I applied to like more than one police force, but knowing that the RCMP would at that time was my number one pick, because I kind of wanted a little bit of the adventure that came along with the possibility of moving all over Canada.
For sure, yeah.
And doing different things. I didn't know that much about the force, to be honest. I just knew that my dad was a Mountie. I really respected him. Seemed like a pretty good gig. And I always kind of just thought I was going to be like a small town cop, rural Alberta. And maybe one day, if I like worked really hard, I might get onto like a major crime unit and work like homicide or something, because like I saw my dad do all that stuff, right? Plus he worked drug section and organized crime, and
just all the different departments that
the Mounties offer a lot of different options. I didn't even know what ERT was until I got in and met guys that did it.
And so ERT, emergency response team, is that okay?
Yeah, that's right. So I guess I went the police route instead. And once I had made up my mind that that's what I was going to do, I just like laser focused on that and just worked as hard as I could to perform the best that I could, especially when I was at training in depot. And because I wanted, there's no guarantee about what your performance at depot is going to result in when you get when you get your badge and you graduate and you get sent out to your posting, but there's kind of an unwritten rule that people talk about, where if you're a strong performer, they're probably going to send you somewhere a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, definitely.
So that because you just don't require quite as much like close
more
supervision.
of a support system.
Yeah,
and there's more of a structure where I don't want to call it micromanaging, but there's definitely a lot more contact and support. Whereas I think an independent worker thinker that is able to kind of be a little bit more self-sufficient, they're going to give them obviously the more remote or challenging roles. Yeah.
So that was part of the reason that I asked to go up north right out of depot as well. At the time, if you got recruited out of Alberta or BC, there was a good chance that you were going back to those places, and you were probably going to be stuck there for a long time, because both of those provinces are chronically short of members. And
is there really any particular reason for that? Is it just population density kind of thing, or like versus Ontario where they've got a lot more of a population?
Yeah, but Ontario's provincial police, right?
OPP,
so RCMP only does federal there. So it's not as much of a demand on the human resource side as like BC is the biggest division. Alberta, I think, is probably the second, like as far as like actual like contract policing police officers. And it's not that I didn't want to come back to Alberta, but I thought, you know what, if I go back to Alberta, that would probably be where we would end up deciding to stay. So I talked to my wife. I went to like a recruitment conference while I was in training and heard a couple of guys talk about the Northern Territories, and I had spent some time up in the Yukon when I worked for forestry. My wife had been up there with her family and they really enjoyed it. So I ended up asking for the Yukon and Northwest Territories as my top two picks, because I thought, well, let's go up there, have like a bit of an adventure while we're young and no kids and stuff like that, and then we'll go from there. And I got it. So that it was
I don't think too many people were applying for those areas, were they?
Well, actually, the Yukon at that time, the Yukon was difficult to get to. And
really?
It was highly sought
like
after.
Like the gold rush lure still kind of was what
I
kind
think
of
it's just because it's such a nice place.
Yeah,
right? Like it's a beautiful
amazing
place, and like lots of cops, lots of Mounties are really big into like hunting and fishing, and it's like an outdoor mecca up in the Yukon, right? So I just asked for Yukon Northwest Territories, got the Yukon, and then there was really only 3 detachments that they would send brand new recruits to: Whitehorse, Watson Lake, or Dawson City, because everything else is like 2 or 3 man spots. And so I just asked for Whitehorse, Dawson City, Watson Lake. and I ended up going to Whitehorse right out of the right out of the gate. Yeah, so I don't have any complaints about the city of Whitehorse at that time anyway. Like, I really enjoyed my time there. Actually, I would say out of anywhere that I've lived in Canada, that's my favorite spot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for sure. I really, really enjoyed it there.
What is it about, is it the remote wilderness, or what is, there's got to be an energy or a feel to the area?
Well, Whitehorse as a city, it's kind of has a bit of like a thriving culture. You know, there's a lot of people that go up there to live a little bit different lifestyle. Like, it's not quite as like pedal to the metal, go, 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 like Northern Alberta, where it's like, you know, you work hard, you play hard.
We kind of get that here, right? A little bit too.
Oh, for sure. It's very similar. Whereas the Yukon's a little bit more laid back, I find. But I mean, Whitehorse has almost all the amenities, right? I think the only big store it doesn't have is like a Costco. And I mean, not that that's really important to me, but
it's nice.
It's not
we make
like
our Costco runs to GP.
You're not living in the middle of nowhere and like getting stuff shipped up on a barge like they do in Nunavut, right?
Oh yeah. Ice road trucker.
So I mean, I think it's the beauty of it. Like, you're right in the mountains. The Yukon River, it like flows right through the city. It is crystal clear, freezing cold, but crystal clear, beautiful water. It's just a beautiful place.
Yeah.
Right. And within minutes, you can be in like complete wilderness right from your backyard, right? Like my old house up there, you'd walk out the backyard onto like an incredible trail network that would take you right up onto Grey Mountain, which was right beside the city. And that mountain was like covered with amazing hiking and mountain biking trails. And there was little lakes back in there. Yeah. And then like the other direction, I'd walk out my front yard, and I was a 5-minute walk from the Yukon River.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
There you go.
So if the government there was a little bit more like the Alberta government, I'd probably live in the Yukon again.
The Alberta government now.
That's what I mean.
And Notley wasn't, I don't think, a positive impact on that province. And that's my own political opinion. So I don't want to stir the pot right out of the gate here. But I mean, so going with, you know, the Yukon, you know, and that picturesque, almost kind of, if most people were to envision it, it would almost be like an Alaskan kind of, you know, painting or feel to it.
For sure.
I mean, the Yukon and the gold rush and everything. I mean, I think most people can make that connection. Mm-hmm. And the question I asked you a little bit right out of the get-go, just a little bit unfair, just because it kind of, you know, has to explain the role that you had within the RCMP. But I kind of did that somewhat intentionally, because there is something that usually catches people that serve, that there's the initial lure, you know, that got you into there. And it sounds to me like, you know, there's definitely a little bit of awareness and comfortability because it's within the family. But you made it, you know, from Whitehorse all the way up to sniper detail for the Prime Minister. Now, regardless of who the Prime Minister is, the position itself and that title is somewhat prestigious and difficult, I would imagine, to be able to get to. You're not going to throw just anybody into that position. So there's got to be an element of, you know, personal achievement, satisfaction. You need to dedicate yourself in a way that is, I think, a little bit more than just kind of making sure you're satisfying your job role, right? There's got to be a passion in there somewhere that you got a sense of, you know, pride in it, fulfillment, really.
Well, so yes, but I mean, the ERT program in itself is the sense of achievement, or the goal, and I can eventually get to how I ended up in Ottawa on that specific detail. But so I go up to the Yukon. I'm a general duty cop, so like a patrol cop, uniform, drive a police car, go to 911 calls, all that, like what the Fort St. John RCMP or Grand Prairie RCMP, exact same idea, right?
Yeah.
I get to know some guys that are on the ERT team up there, because it was every province and territory used to have their own team. Most of them still do, I think. And, but like some of the big centers had full-time teams, or that was your full-time job. But most of the smaller places had like, you would do a day job, and then ERT was like additional, like a part-time duty. And so I got to know some of those guys up in Whitehorse. They were all like switched on, competent, hardworking cops. I got along with all of them. And that's how I kind of started to learn about what ERT was. So like 4-month service, an email comes out from the team leader at the time saying they're going to hold the tryout. You know, there at that time there was service, like you had to have so much service. I think it was 3 years at the time, 2 to 3 years on the job before you could actually get officially trained in as an ERT guy. But the tryout was open to anyone. Like basically they were just looking at an expression of interest.
Oh, okay.
So I worked a night shift, went home, slept for like 45 minutes, came back down, ran the physical component of the tryout. There was only like a handful of us there that did it. I kind of got selected by default because I was the only one that passed the physical aspect, which was like running, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, bench press, stuff like that.
Basic activity physical.
Yeah. You know, all timed and stuff like that. So, but I was still very junior, right? I wasn't even done like my 6 months probationary period called field coaching. And so the team leader and the 2IC, like the second in command, talked to me and they said, look, like you can't really start coming out with the team until you at least finish your 6 months, your field coaching. But, you know, once that's done, you can start coming out to training days, and we'll take you on what they called at the time as like a striker, like a kind of like a try, like a, in the organized crime world, it would be called like a hang around.
Oh, okay.
Right? So I started going to training days. And at first, you know, I'm playing bad guy in scenarios. I'm, you know, packing ammo around for the guys on their range days and putting up targets, stuff like that. And then, but very quickly, you know, they're getting me all geared up with the equipment that they use and the firearm, like the extra guns that they get trained on and used. And they start teaching me like the shooting, like the courses of fire, like the shooting qualifications. And they start showing me almost all the firearm stuff at the beginning. So I learned about the MP5 and the C8 and the Sig Sauer pistol. Oh, sorry, at that time it was still a Smith & Wesson, which ended up changing to a Sig. But anyway, and they start taking me through like all the ERT shooting tests are different than the general duty shooting tests, right? And so
basic training for that.
Basically, yeah, they're starting to get me ready for the eventual going to the national course in Ottawa. And at the same time, they're checking me out to see like, okay, what's this guy like? Is he solid? Does he fit in? Has he got a good attitude? Does he work hard? Or is
just lightly pressure testing, you know,
exactly.
What do you like here?
Yeah. Oh,
what's the character
tons
like?
Of that, right? Tons of like, it's like a prolonged 2-year tryout process.
Yeah.
And there was a couple of other guys that were in the queue to go on the course ahead of me. So they did. And eventually, when I had about 3 years service, I ended up getting sent to Ottawa on the course. Course went well. I think I performed pretty well on it. I came back to Whitehorse. I was still working the road at the time, like still working general duty, but I was an official trained ERT guy on the team. So I was a brand new ERT member. And so you'd get your monthly training days and you'd go to call outs, right? Like high risk calls. The most common one for like those part-time teams, I would say, is probably either like a high risk search warrant for drugs, guns, stuff like that. Or like an armed and barricaded, you know, some guy ends up in a domestic with his wife, threatens her with a gun. She takes off. He's alone in the house, barricaded. Well, he's gonna have to surrender eventually, right? So then ERT gets called, and it's basically like the Canadian version of a SWAT call out, right? So that's the kind of stuff I did up there. And then while I was still working in the Yukon, a couple years later, I got to go on the sniper course, which is, it's all part of the ERT program, but it's like once you finish the initial course to be like your general ERT member, then you can start going into specialties like breaching, sniper, rappel master, etc.,
Gotcha.
medic, stuff like that. So I went on the sniper course, finished that, came back to the Yukon for a little bit longer. And then once I was done my time, I had transferred to a second detachment up in remote rural Yukon, north of Whitehorse, called Mayo. And once I was done my time there, I was actually supposed to go back to a plainclothes unit in Whitehorse.
A plain clothes?
Yeah, like
just kind of
like a detective type job. When I got a phone call asking if I would be interested in going to Ottawa, because I had already been putting out feelers, right? Like there was 3 teams that were kind of like potential options for me, as far as like where I could transfer to and do that job full time. Well, sorry, maybe there was more than 3, but there was only 3 I was really looking at. And so Edmonton had some full-time spots, but not all. Calgary, same thing. And then Ottawa. And I mean, you know, there was Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, but I didn't want to go to any of those places. So Edmonton and Calgary, full-time spots were full. I could have probably taken a transfer and done it, done it part-time and then eventually got full-time. But Ottawa was calling and they were offering full-time right away. So we decided, well,
let's give her.
Let's go again.
Let's
like
try
kind
it
of
out.
the same thing with the North, right? Like, let's go give it a try and see how it goes.
Yeah.
And I knew guys, I had guys that I trained with that were on that Ottawa team. And when they were working, according to them, like it was really good. Training was awesome. The pace was good. Like, you're hearing lots of guys like in Alberta, Vancouver, getting burnt out because the volume was just go, go, go. They were never home.
Oh yeah.
And so it seemed like the Ottawa team had a better balance because it was all protective work or federal or supporting other police forces. So I was like, oh, this is perfect, right? Because we were starting to have a young family at the time. So I was like, you know what? If I get like a decent operation like every week on top of the full-time training and all the other things, like I'll be happy. Like that would be perfect for me. So that's why I went to Ottawa.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
When I showed up there, Harper was still PM. So like the protective stuff was all new to me. I had never done any of that while I was up north. So it wasn't like super complicated, but it was a learning curve. But I had an incredible corporal at the time who like took me under his wing and showed me how they did business. And I think I learned it pretty quick. And then we also so we did the protective work, plus we still did like warrant service for our different plainclothes units, like RCMP federal investigations. Plus, if the Ottawa police or the OPP were doing like a big roundup, like multiple,
you would be supplementing.
They would call us.
Out.
Yeah. So like, example, Ottawa police is doing a big roundup for like guns and gang unit, something like that.
Yeah.
They're hitting like 10 houses. They'd do 5, we'd do 3, OPP would do 2, something like that.
Just a blitz.
Yeah.
Go hit them.
Yeah.
Hit them all. Oh, so that was part of, I guess, detail to the Prime Minister. Was that a rotational thing, or were you kind of assigned as part of that detail?
That, I guess maybe eventually we kind of got to that a little bit, but it was mostly just, we were doing our own thing, and whenever they would call for support, then we would go, right? They didn't always need snipers. They didn't always need ERT, but they would usually get like priority over other tasks if we were
you're available,
if we were limited on bodies. But we had a decent sized team, so I don't ever recall a time where we said no to PMPD. Like, I don't.
No.
No.
I can't imagine that would be something you'd turn your nose up to, wouldn't it?
Actually, when I first got there, the officer in charge had a little bit of a fight with them because, like it seems like everything just with life in general, the RCMP runs like a big wheel, right? Like, what was old is new again, and then becomes old, and then becomes new again. And so I think like the guys before I got there, they did like a ton of work with PMPD, like the Prime Minister's Protection Detail. When I first showed up, we weren't doing hardly any unless there was like a specific need. And then it kind of transitioned back to like, by the time I left, we were doing stuff with PMPD, like a lot. So the big wheel just keeps going around and things just rinse and repeat.
It's kind of an interesting behind the scenes as far as how that goes, though, isn't it? Like, have you, like, during that period of time, did you see already things leading up to where there were concerns, like maybe a difference between law and political points of view, and maybe where that started to become a little bit of a concern that, you know, was something that you were starting to pay attention to a little bit? Or was it just, you know, all in one shot, there was a line for you that you kind of started having a bit of a problem with?
Well,
or not a problem, that's bad wording, but you know what I mean?
Well, I think I didn't have any special access to the PM, right? Like, yeah, I helped support his protection a lot, but I was never like up close and personal with him. Like, I never even met the guy face to face. I never even spoke with him.
Oh yeah. No, I meant like as in just in general. Like,
just observing?
Within the force and I guess culture.
Yeah.
Like,
within the force for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
I meant this, sorry, I should have been a little bit more of a broader kind of, you know, I noticed it within, you know, my industry alone,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, to try and explain, I guess, where I was going with that curiosity question. And because when I got into a position of management or leadership, it was like every year, graduating year, I would notice a different mindset enter the workforce. And then, you know, over a few years, it was always, you know, entry level positions because it was, you know, obviously graduating. But then over a period of time, you know, it was more kind of higher up. It was, you know, engineers and then filtering into management, and that kind of went, and that affects culture, and that, you know, was creating a lot of, I guess, concerns and frustrations in different ways at that time. I mean, we all kind of think of COVID more or less being the focal point. From there on, you know, we had, you know, enough, but there's a lot before that. Like, this podcast is a result of, I think, a frustration that I had leading up to before COVID. It was just a chance and fluke timing that I started this at the very beginning of COVID. And so that question kind of comes because that was something I wanted to address prior to, right? And there was a bit of a culture shift. There was a lot happening up to that point already. And that's within my own industry. Up here where we thought we were kind of sheltered a little bit from it, right? You know, Yukon might even kind of have that where you think you're a little bit more of a bubble separated from it all and not quite as severe, but that's not true. You know, we are a little bit up here in some ways, but that question I'm asking is because in your job up to that point, did you start seeing like where, okay, the job role, maybe the requirements or a cultural mindset, you know, started to already shift where there was concerns in some ways that was kind of leading up to maybe saying, okay, you know, enough is enough?
Yes, I would say pre-COVID though, I would have experienced more of that when I was working up north, when I was working in Whitehorse and Mayo. Like, some things that kind of come to mind are like, you see people getting promoted or transferred into positions that they're clearly not the best candidate for, but for other reasons, they get slid into those positions. You see, maybe some officers fresh out of the academy do some relatively fresh, like maybe say and do some things that are a little bit questionable, and they're not, and they don't get corrected for it.
Yeah.
You get like a lot of responsibility dumped on a select few of people, like just constantly asking the workhorses to do more.
Yeah.
And while other people get to just coast along and no one ever addresses it with them, except for like maybe the occasional supervisor. And then of course, like, I mean, you hear the word woke all the time, but there's definitely like that ideology is taken deep root in the RCMP for sure.
You see that in a lot of other areas too.
I think it's almost everywhere.
Yeah.
Especially government institutions. And, you know, for the longest time, I kind of just accepted the fact that, like, okay, well, I'm just going to say it. I'm not a minority.
Yeah.
And I'm a male.
Yeah.
And if that means I don't get certain promotions or positions, well, I guess I just have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And as long as they just let me do my job, I just want to be good at catching bad guys, right? I just want to be a good cop. So I'm here, I'm employed as a police officer. As long as they don't just throw me under the bus and I can just go to work and do my job, well then whatever. If I don't get promoted to inspector one day, whatever. Not really a goal of mine anyway.
But at the same time, you know, it almost kind of undermines or discredits some of the hard work and application that you dedicate yourself to. Because at the end of the day, sometimes, and this is a little bit even in the industry that I'm in, it shifted a little bit where knowledge and experience has been devalued to a point where people are just paying for time.
Yep.
And the ability to keep a standard in place is through, well, at the end of the day, safety. Mm-hmm. You got to have a procedure. You got to have this, and this offsets any kind of accountability or skill set that you're bringing to the table, and is really the root cause to maybe safety in our case. But I think that element is true. Sounds to me, anyways, the way you're talking in RCMP and just about any kind of. I mean, it's a cultural shift, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Where no good deed goes unpunished in some cases, right? So it's almost. You're going to apply yourself because of, who you are and how you want to apply yourself, regardless of who's looking. And that's just how you operate. But at the same time, I mean, where's that sense of accomplishment when, other people may be able to get there through other means that aren't because of personal amplitude?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think another thing that really bothered me while I was up north is like people constantly passing the buck or shucking responsibility and not wanting to like own the risk that comes with making a decision.
Yeah.
It's like, look, we respond to 911 calls, or we're the people, like as the police, we're the people who get called to deal with dangerous situations that other people are not authorized to deal with, or maybe it's beyond their ability to deal with. Like sometimes we need to just make the best decision we can with what we know at the time. And it's not going to be perfect. I don't think anyone expects us to be perfect, but we just have to own it. Right. Like, but you'd constantly see like, let's say middle managers might be the word for it. Like, shucking the responsibility either up or down. And then it would just, it made it very frustrating, very difficult to actually get anything done, or to actually get like an effective course of action. Like, I'll give you an example I can think of. High risk barricaded call. think it was about New Year's Eve. We got general duty guys on containment. ERT team wants to pump some CS gas into the house. Incident commanders won't let that happen. But it's like 35 below. The GD guys have been out there for hours.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't have all the Gucci winter kit that the ERT guys do. And the explanation is that there was this false myth, this false belief floating around out there for the longest time that if ERT gases a house, the RCMP pays for it, which is not true. That has been, I hate to use the word, but that's been determined to be false anyways. But incident commander won't do it. Eventually guy comes out, gets arrested. But those two GD guys doing containment stood out there for hours and hours and hours in like with insufficient gear. They both got frostbite so bad on their toes that they had to get amputations of toes.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. Yes. And that situation could have been resolved way faster if the incident commander would have been like, okay, this guy's not giving up. You know, there's like a threshold, like a number of criteria he could have gone through. He could have easily justified letting ERT put like tear gas into that house to force that guy to come out. And
or at the very least, you know, were these people, these two guys that were getting frostbite, did they not say, hey, like, freezing here, like, can we swap out? I need to warm up. Bring me a pair of boots, something.
That falls back on the problem of not having enough people, right? Because it wasn't in the city of Whitehorse. It was in one of the smaller communities. And so they're probably the only two GD guys out there besides the ERT guys. And the ERT team was always, like at that time, I think the ERT team was maybe 5-6 guys, maybe.
And so when you say the commander, you know, it falls on the RCMP, is that like an optics thing? Like where they want to collateral damage? Like there's a little bit of a public mind, you know, thing going on with this defund the police and, you know, all this other kind of stuff. Was that kind of something that he was thinking, oh man, like if we go in there and try and contain the situation, it's going to be perceived through the media or publicly as a little bit more like overbearing kind of thing? Was that kind of what he was he was mindful of?
I don't know, because I mean, it's, you know,
you can't speak for him, but I'm just that
tactical teams use chemical agents all the time, right?
Yeah.
But up there, it hadn't really been like it hadn't become like a regular adopted practice yet. It was relatively like it was happening down south in some of the bigger teams on a more regular basis, but up there it was like a new thing for our team at the time. And, but I think it was probably more like, I don't want to get in trouble. Like if I'm the incident commander, it's like, oh, I don't want to get in trouble from the higher ups for having to pay for this house, because there's that false belief that you might have to, that they would have had, that the RCMP would have had to cover the cost.
Oh, okay.
Which wasn't really true, but even if it was, like, well, because you were afraid to make a decision, two guys have permanent damage to their feet, right? Yeah. These are two operational cops. And I mean, like, I don't think those guys ever pursued any kind of legal action against the RCMP, but it's like, but it could have ended their career and completely, you know, negatively impacted their physical health for the rest of their life.
Oh, absolutely. For sure.
It's very typical RCMP culture to just like, when there's a problem, let's just ignore it, and hopefully with enough time it goes away. Like, especially you'll see that with bad publicity a lot, right? If the force takes bad publicity, they'll quite often go into like shutdown mode, not say anything, you know, at most they'll be like, whoa, can't comment, there's an ongoing investigation. But I think it seems to be the tactic is like, let's just say nothing, and eventually enough time will pass and more things will pop up. And
it's not even that much time, is it?
No.
Like, people have amnesia. People, like, within a short period of time, it could be 3 weeks, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, wait a minute. I mean, I mentioned Jody Wilson-Raybould earlier. That was a big deal. SNC Lavalin. I mean, it made The Simpsons. Nobody remembers any of that now anymore. Maybe the odd kind of reference, but there's no teeth behind it. It's just like, oh yeah, it's almost come so, well, people have gotten so used to it that it's like there's no shock value anymore. You know, and the alarming elements of it now is just like, oh, well, you know, whatever, tell me something new. And then it's the next topic from one week to the next, right? And you move on through one extreme example after another of no accountability. And like what you're saying, just kind of ignore it long enough for the next thing to pop up. And it's so frequent now that, I mean, by the time there's any kind of follow through, maybe with the one-off, you know, examples, people have forgotten and moved on about it. Amnesia is a real thing. People like public amnesia. I mean, nobody really remembers much anymore.
Well, I think we live in a time where if you have a smart device, you're just bombarded with information nonstop, especially if you're on social media. And I'm guilty of it for sure.
Absolutely. We all are.
You'll see things pop up once in a while and you're just like, oh yeah, like life has been so chaotic and I've just been like paying attention to all of this new stuff that I even forgot that was a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, so sorry. I went on and on and on about my time in the North, but like, I guess, so yeah, I saw things, just to kind of summarize, I saw things that was happening in the force that were like reflective of all of the like culture and societal changes that have been happening in Canada, that people like, you know, the intellectual dark web types have been talking about, like Jordan Peterson being like the big Canadian one.
Yep.
You know, like the suppression of speech and freedom of expression and basically like denial of reality that you can see right in front of your face and being forced to accept that, or else you're canceled.
Yeah.
You're demonized, right?
Exactly.
That same mindset and culture was seeping into the RCMP. And I would say, from what I see now, has completely captured the leadership of the RCMP anyway. I mean, I still know like frontline cops that are like common sense type people, but all the public communication that you see coming out of the force, like from the commissioner's office or the social media accounts, like posts made by the RCMP, I know I'm not the only Canadian that's like shaking their head at it and thinking like, oh my God, this is who's supposed to protect our national security. But when I was in Ottawa, that's when I was in more of like, even though I was tasked with supporting the protection of the PM, our team was much more autonomous, right? Like we didn't, there might've been a little bit of politicking, but like not really at my level, really. It was pretty drama free up until COVID, for me anyway. And it was mostly guys who just wanted to be there and be the best at ERT that they could be. And they were always trying to push better to get better in training and better equipment. And I think the ERT program anyways, at that time, was probably like the last remaining true meritocracy in the RCMP. Like,
wow,
it didn't matter whether you were male or female or the color of your skin or your sexual orientation. Like, if you try out for ERT, they definitely did a really good job of making it like the most objective selection process that existed in the RCMP, I would say. Like, and
the last island,
basically,
so to speak,
where it's like, look, these are the standards.
Yeah.
They haven't been diminished for anybody.
Yeah.
Like, this is the standard. If you pass like pre-selection, you go to selection. If you pass selection, you go to like pre-course training, like kind of the striker mindset. And then if the team, if you're a good fit, you get sent on the national course. If you pass the course, you're loaded onto the team, right? And then once you get to that point, you kind of have to do something pretty serious to get kicked off the team, or you have to speak out against the government.
Wow. Well, there you go. And she's
or even just support
one
a friend who spoke out against the government.
Yeah. Well, you definitely picked up one of the two, didn't you?
Well, I'm talking about me and a couple of friends of mine.
Oh, so there was at that time, there was you and a couple people that ended up kind of refusing to take the shot?
Well,
Or
it's basically yes. I mean, definitely a different story for each guy, but 3 of us got pushed off the team. Yeah.
what was it about that? Like, what was your position on that then for saying, no, this isn't something that is right for me, and you refused to take the shot, and in turn you were, I guess, relieved of duties?
Okay, I'll try and be super concise about it. So, 2020, I wasn't paying attention to anything. They had changed our schedule, basically 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off idea. 2 weeks on, I'm at work. We show up like after the initial lockdown, and they switch us around, put us in small groups, alter the schedule. Show up for my first rotation back. There's like a couple of guys and they have masks on, and there's only like a small group of us. And I was just like, are we really doing this? Like, this is the whole reason why we're in these small groups.
Yeah.
And they were all like, oh yeah, sure. Off they go, and never wore one again while we were at work. But we were some of the only people that were working in the whole building. Right. So we us and like maybe a couple other units had the whole giant building to ourselves. And we just stuck in our pairs, right? Like, I had my sniper partner. We rode in the same truck. We had this, with all of our gear, and that's how we kind of just limited contact. So when I wasn't at work, I was working on we had bought a couple acres of land in the Ottawa area, and we're like making it like our own little like private campsite. And so when I wasn't at work, I was working on that.
Oh, nice.
So I was either at work, not listening to the news,
Yeah.
and just trying to focus on my job, because I stopped listening to the news a long time ago, because I knew that they fabricate and manipulate everything, even pre-COVID. And then when I wasn't at work, I was in the bush. So I wasn't really watching much of it at all. My wife was keeping a closer eye on things, and she was the one who, I would say probably like end of 2020, creeping into beginning of 2021, she starts raising the alarm about her concerns about everyone's talking about this new mRNA technology.
Yeah.
And so that was essentially the beginning of when I really started to look into things more seriously. I was following Brett Weinstein from the Dark Horse podcast, him and his wife, Heather Hanging. They were like up to that point, they were like my go-to source for quality information related to COVID. And they, like, through them, I learned about Pierre Corey, Peter McCullough, all these huge specialist doctors. One's an ICU lung specialist. The other one's like the most published cardiologist in the history of the world. They're all talking about they have treatments. They've developed treatments that are like very, very effective at keeping people out of the hospital, keeping people from getting worse. Even showing promise for like prevention of COVID. So I'm watching these guys, and I'm watching their interviews. I'm watching them testify in front of Senates, and you can see they're fired up. They're passionate, right? Because it seems like we have the answer and no one's listening to us.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you start seeing, the attacks against people like Joe Rogan and others who use those same protocols. And you see the way that the media is portraying everyone and portraying these medicines. And it's like, well, that's a major red flag, right? Like, why on earth would you try and destroy someone's reputation who's saving lives, who's keeping people out of the hospital, and who's treating COVID patients, and has like a stellar medical record up to this point?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, like, this Nobel Prize winning medicine, for example, is like nothing but horse paste. It's like,
exactly.
What?
Yeah.
So none of that made sense.
Exactly.
I mean, it makes sense if you know that it's a propaganda campaign to discredit early treatment so that they can usher in an EUA for the vaccine, for the new vaccine tech, then it makes sense. But at that point, I was just like, well, that's a major red flag, right? They're trying to destroy these people who are just trying to save life. And then that is kind of drifted into looking into trying to decide on my own, I guess you'd call it investigation, as to whether or not the vaccine was truly safe and effective like they said it was. And so it's like June of 2021, I think, I see Byron Bridle do a press conference with Dr. Patrick Phillips and a former politician, Derek Sloan, down in Ontario. And, you know, Phillips was talking about, I think he was talking about how, like some of the injuries that he was seeing. He ended up losing his license because he was writing vaccine exemptions. I think because he was writing vaccine exemptions, and also because he was like filing vaccine injury reports.
Really?
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah.
Unreal.
Yeah. Like they were being rejected, but he kept submitting them. That, my understanding is, he kept submitting them. He ended up losing his license to practice medicine. Anyway, and Byron Bridle was talking about how he had found he got the information from the Japanese about the Pfizer trials, and it proved that Pfizer knew, that that the mRNA shot, like with the lipid nanoparticle platform, didn't stay local to the shoulder like they said it did. It would go all over the body. It could even cross the blood-brain barrier, and it would even seem to accumulate in like reproductive areas, especially.
Yep.
I think he said like especially of young women.
Absolutely.
And so right away, I was home. I was in Alberta at the time, and we, you know, my wife and I had been already expressing, like, we had already pretty much decided that, yeah, we're not taking this. Like, we've looked at who's at risk from COVID. We have a plan, like a treatment plan, because of all these other doctors I talked about earlier. And like, there's a chance we may have been exposed to it already, and we just don't even know. I really didn't feel like I was comfortable with it yet. And then when I saw that with Bridle, I knew that something was seriously going to go wrong. And so that's when we started to show that to other members of our family back here and be like, okay, I'm just a cop. This guy develops vaccines for a living.
Yeah.
Like, watch him and listen to what he has to say. Like, if he's concerned, we have a right to be concerned.
For sure.
And then so start looking at all of like as much product information as I could get at the time. I don't think like the Pfizer documents, none of that stuff had become available yet. So I looked at like Health Canada. I looked at the CDC website, maybe the FDA's as well. I was trying to find like official government sources that had information about the shots. And they didn't really have very much at all. They had like product monographs, which didn't really mean much to me. But there was, even in those documents, there was like some acknowledgement that they didn't have a whole lot of information about safety profile or effectiveness. So then I went to the manufacturers themselves. Like, I looked at AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Moderna. I looked at the fact sheets. That was all that was I could find publicly available on their website at the time. And right on their own sheets, it specified, like, for mRNA, like Pfizer, Moderna, observed increased risk of myocarditis, pericarditis.
Yeah.
And at that time, my own brother had suffered like some serious heart pain for weeks after one of his Pfizer shots. And so I was like, okay, I'm very physical. It seems to be affecting like young, healthy, athletic people that really push themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty similar to my brother genetically. I'm not taking one of those. And with the AZ and J&J shots, there was an acknowledgement of like increased risk of clotting events. And we had already heard about that with AstraZeneca in the news, right?
And the J&J.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, well, Still didn't know a lot, but I was like, okay, if the manufacturers are admitting it, but our own government and media are pretending like it's conspiracy theory,
Yeah.
there's something messed up. And so I just kept looking. And of course, so I'm following Pierre Corey, Peter McCullough, Byron Bridle, so the FLCCC in the US, the Canadian COVID Care Alliance in Canada, and then there's groups in the UK. I'm following all these doctors and these scientists, right? And pretty soon, they're talking about early treatment and the censorship and suppression of early treatment, which to me is like criminal negligence causing death. That's criminal, leading into the serious adverse reactions that they're seeing from the shots. So you got people talking the heart issues right away, the clotting issues right away, and then you start hearing doctors like scientist from MIT, Stephanie Seneff. She's like one of their senior researchers.
Okay.
And she's talking about like neurological injuries related to the COVID shots. And then Ryan Cole, the pathologist from Idaho, starts talking about all the stuff that he's seeing in his lab, and like a major uptick in like weird aggressive cancers, and how he's kind of like correlating that to the timeline of the rollout. And then, Robert Malone and all these other people that are like subject matter experts in these fields. Oh, Geert Vanden Bosch was one of the very first ones. He's like a vaccine guy from, he's Dutch, I think, Belgium, maybe?
I'm not sure. I'm not really familiar with that
so
name.
I think I actually heard about him. That's right. I knew about him before I even knew about Pierre Corey. And again, from the Dark Horse podcast, I saw him interviewed by Brett Weinstein. And so he had worked for like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations and Gavi. Like he's a vaccine
He knows
guy
what's
too.
going on.
He's been involved in vaccine development for a lot of years. That's like his field of expertise. And he was saying like, you do not mass vaccinate into the middle of a pandemic, especially with
I do remember that.
Especially with a non-sterilizing shot, right?
Yeah.
Like one that doesn't prevent infection and transmission.
You want to do that prior to leading up,
right?
Because if you do it in the middle, correct me if I'm wrong, if you do it in the middle of a pandemic, then you're actually exacerbating it, because that virus has the ability to be able to adapt and overcome, and the resiliency in the different strains now is going to make it a lot worse.
Yeah, that was one of his issues, was talking about like the creation of more infectious,
Variants
more dangerous variants.
Yeah,
right, because you're basically like putting a evolutionary selection pressure on the virus with these non-sterilizing shots. So that was one major concern. But then he also talked a lot about how it seemed to interfere with the innate immune system, not your adaptive one, but your innate immune system that you're like born with, which is like pretty powerful. And I mean, I that's way outside of my scope, but I remember him saying like, essentially what I remember, like the summary of what I remember him saying was like, it will interfere with your innate immune system, and essentially it will suppress your body's ability to fight similar viruses in the future.
Wow.
Right? If you take these shots.
So autoimmune.
Essentially, right? Like, or it's like a suppression of the immune system.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, this guy probably knows what he's talking about. And so I remember having those conversations with a bunch of guys at work, like before I got sent away. And there was only like maybe one or two guys, well, one guy in particular that was on this of the same mindset of me. And there was other guys that were kind of like questioning. And I was, we're having like these fiery discussions in the work truck. And I'll never forget, it happened more than once. One of the guys that I worked with, he just kept saying like, well, I have two sisters that are nurses, and they say the only way out of this is a vaccine. And I'm like, well, yeah, well, your sisters obviously know more about healthcare than I do, but
yeah,
if I want to know about vaccines, why not go to like a vaccinologist or a virologist, right? Like,
I would like to not expand, but kind of comment on that, because I had the same kind of concerns that you just explained. It was very in line. It's not that you'd get shut down because obviously somebody who has no education or understanding about vaccines would turn around and say, well, are you a doctor? And then, of course, now you're put in a position where you got to say no. And they're like, well, the science says, and safe and effective, and the government, and, you know, that whole narrative that kind of goes with it. But it's really hard not to look at the other side too, where a lot of the people that are experts and very distinguished, established in their not only career, but their profession, like their expertise when it came to that specific subject, that are putting themselves in a line of fire, and in a lot of cases kind of being shamed and removed from their positions of a knowledge, a position of understanding and knowledge that should almost be included in the team of people that should be part of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then anybody who spoke against it was a conspiracy theory, and it was to shut everybody up. And then at the same time, you know, lockstep with it, the government was issuing all of these mandates and protocols that we're supposed to follow that were so wildly nonsensical. Like, it just didn't make sense to me. Like, you know, can't have family members come over for Christmas unless they're vaccinated. Glory holes instead of sex. The Prime Minister asking adults to leave the room while he addresses children. I mean, like, and it just goes on and on. Never mind, like, the changes with how many masks you have, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, and you can walk through a restaurant and with a mask, and then when you sit down, of course, you're okay. And you can't go to a gym that's supposed to be healthy, but you can go out and eat as much as you want. Well, you know, I mean, it's just one thing after another, and I think the list of examples can go on and on and on. But the thread, and I guess the common denominator with it all, that after a while you really got to pause and act, is why is it that you have educated people speaking against it with voices of concern that are putting themselves in the line of fire? And you have, that makes sense. Like, when they explain and articulate what they're trying to say, it's like, okay, this is actually coming from a place of real understanding that I'm getting. And then you look at where you're supposed to be following and getting your information from, and it's just like, man, none of this really does make sense. And if you speak against it, you know, following the science is looking at everything. Following the science isn't just blindly going in one direction and then doubling down anytime there's a hiccup. And when we're in this together and it's for the safety of humanity, how come we're so quick to attack the people who are voicing any kind of possible adverse effects to it? That's evil. Like, none of it makes sense, though, right?
Well, not if you're looking at it from an actual humanitarian standpoint.
Well, and their selling feature was from a humanitarian standpoint. That was their selling feature. That was the vehicle that all of this was being delivered on. I think apparently
every globalist agenda right now is sold to us with like, it's compassionate or virtuous.
Yeah.
Right. Even if it requires the sacrifice of the poor or the vulnerable. But right? They just gloss over that part.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, follow the science during COVID was nothing more than a talking point, like a slogan that just, like, safe and effective. Doesn't matter if there's evidence. Evidence doesn't seem to matter anymore. It's just whoever repeats the same thing enough and burns it into the psyche of the public wins the day. They win. They control the narrative. Policy by the politicians, decisions of the police, decisions from the court. It's all influenced by what they think the public interest is. And so if the public opinion poll shows Justin Trudeau that he should initiate a snap election in 2021 and use vaccine mandates and passports as a wedge issue, that's what he does, whether the evidence exists or not. He knew. And so that's another reason why I decided I wasn't going to take it. Back in, like, July and August of 2021, maybe even earlier than that, you had, like, Theresa Tam, Rochelle Walensky from the CDC, Anthony Fauci from the NIH, even Justin Trudeau himself on camera admitting that the COVID vaccines did not stop infection and transmission. Yet, right before the snap election, he announces that they're going to implement the federal vaccine mandate, which is what affected me. And then, of course, that led to like other mandates for travel, etc. And as soon as he initiated that, then it came down the pipe provincially.
Yeah.
Right? Like Doug Ford just, oh, yes, sir.
Yeah.
And just followed right
It
suit.
was sweeping. Yeah. Right across
and it went
every
across the
province.
country.
Yeah.
But the feds were the first ones to initiate that. And so in July, he admitted it didn't stop infection transmission. In August, he announced the intention to introduce the mandate. October, after winning the election, him and Chrystia Freeland get up on stage and announce the official beginning of the mandate to prevent the spread of COVID. It's like, well, dum-dum, 3 months ago, you said it didn't do that. You know it doesn't.
Yeah.
And like, oh, by the way, even at that time, if you looked at the public health data that was available online with like, I think I looked at almost all of the provinces and territories, as much as I could get my hands on anyway. But like, let's just use Ontario and Alberta, for example. It was clear by then that it was like, if you looked at the pie charts or whatever they were using, the donut charts, that the people who had taken 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot were like increasingly accounting for the hospital admissions, intensive care, and death related to with COVID, whatever you want to say, related to COVID.
Yeah.
And the unvaccinated percentage, which was getting smaller and smaller as the months went by. And I mean, people at that time, people were like, well, it's still, there's still way more unvaccinated people that died. He's like, yeah, but you're talking about like the last year where almost no one was vaccinated.
Yeah.
And people who die or people who are hospitalized or die within like 2 or 3 weeks of their dose are still considered unvaccinated, right? Not until that like 14 or 21 day period passes by.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that kind of varied. I think it was 14 days for the most part, but some wouldn't recognize it for a full 21 days.
Yeah, that's right. Anyways, all that to be said, like they were fudging the numbers essentially in their favor of their narrative. And it was already obvious that these shots did not stop people from getting sick. And like, anecdotally, just myself, like I've had COVID 1 time. I know other people who've been boosted right up that claim to have had it like multiple times. Maybe I'm just fortunate, but I think I have strong natural immunity from my COVID infection.
Yeah.
And I don't have a suppressed immune system for repeated shot. That's what I think.
I got COVID twice. And that doesn't really matter. I don't understand why natural immunity was such a negative thing. And in fact, it's part of the problem if you weren't vaccinated and then you got sick. I have family members who are vaccinated and they got sick and they were able to go uptown because they were vaccinated. And then if you weren't and you got sick, you were the problem. And I mean, this is just going into that whole, at that time, I think the other thing that a lot of people, there was an element there too, kind of going on that people didn't really want to speak out. And so anybody who's looking at this from the perspective that we just outlined up until now, there were so many people that seemed to have bought into this that the alarming part wasn't even almost the government and how this was being handled was almost a secondary concern over the fact that there were so many people that were going in there or buying into this that it looked like, if you didn't, you looked at it from like how we just explained, you're looking around, you're like, man, what is going on? You almost double guess your own judgment sometimes.
Absolutely.
And then you don't want to say anything. Because you're like, well, am I the only guy who really looks at it this way? Like, what is happening right now? And that was the concerning part. And that's where I think a lot of people really started to kind of have concern because they felt like them and a very small group of people that they knew of were like-minded in that. And where do you go? I mean, there's a million little groups that would form out of that for support, but those are very short-lived groups. Usually there was always kind of a little bit of a erosion within the group, and you're back on your own again.
Yeah. So I would agree that what the government was doing was not my biggest concern.
It was how everybody was reacting to it. It
was looking at the people around me that I thought I knew I could trust, and all of a sudden we're cut out of their life.
Yeah.
And there's no communication, and they're looking at you like you're a danger to to the community. You're a threat. And I was way more concerned about people will probably think I'm being dramatic here, but these are the thoughts that I was actually having. Was like, is the OPP going to come for me one day? Right? Like, I thought briefly about the RCMP, like, is my own team going to come for me one day? Like with public health or something. And or to put me in a camp of some kind.
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, that you're being ridiculous. Like, they would send the OPP because it's not a conflict of interest. Like, that's exactly how that thought process went. I'm sitting there out in the bush at our little campsite, and I'm honestly sitting there like working away, and I'm thinking these thoughts in my head, like, is my own team going to come for me one day? And then I was just like, nah, they'll send the OPP because it's not a conflict of interest. And then I'm like, oh my God, am I actually thinking this right now?
Well, what period of time was this? Was this before, like after you had refused to take the vaccine shot, or what period of time was this?
I had already made it clear I wasn't taking it, but I wasn't even off of work yet. This was like fall. Okay. This was like fall 2021 when I was like thinking like, I don't think I had even done a single like interview or anything yet. But I was like really, really fighting with like, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? But these are like, it was just a roller coaster, right? Like, how bad is this going to get? Because you got Trudeau going around campaigning, yelling into the microphone about how dangerous we are and how we cannot sit on a plane beside someone.
Exactly. Yeah.
And specifically saying that not only was an unvaccinated person a threat to an unvaccinated person, or to a vaccinated person, which makes no sense. Like, obviously your protection doesn't protect anything. Well, right?
True.
If you don't wear your body armor, that makes my body armor ineffective.
Yeah.
Because that was the thing we'd always hear, right? Oh, it's just like wearing a seatbelt or body armor. Like, that's what the RCMP was saying. Like, whatever. But he was also specifically saying that we were dangerous to people's kids.
Yeah.
And that to me was another major red flag of like, okay, if you want to incite people to violence, you make them think that there's a threat to their kids.
Yeah.
And so like I was starting to worry about like, is there going to be like a mob of people from my community show up around our house? Because they all know now that like, oh, Danny and Piper aren't allowed into the hockey rink. They're not allowed to coach hockey. They're not allowed to play hockey. Like, what's going on? Well, at that time, there was only one reason.
Yeah. The thing is that when you're trying to do the process of elimination and rationalize this in a logical way without feeling like you're getting too crazy and out of hand with it, where's that line? And when you see where the potential of this going is, it's hard. It's like, where's that boundary of concern that you should really have, and how should you react to it? Because then you start going into, well, I'll move away, or I'll just, what do I do? And how am I going to prepare for all of this? And at the same time, deal with, day-to-day life, and that those pressures start to get to you, and the weird, patterns that, like you talked about hockey, and one of the memories that I have about it was, if you weren't vaccinated, you weren't allowed to watch hockey. You had to be in a part of the building where they put black curtains around the glass, It's like, well, what's that for? Well, you're not vaccinated. It's like, well, what does that have to do with anything? Like, you got to put curtains up so we can't see our kids play. Like, where's the rationale in all of this? And so that's the concerning part, is how do you deal with moving within polite society, so to speak, going to, well, you can't go to restaurants, you can't do much of anything. And then you talked about the kids, and they were giving out, in this area anyways, they're giving out hot dogs to school kids to get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, it was against parental awareness, you know, and we're starting to push that boundary of where, you're talking about the kids. I mean, you're taking a boundary now that is pretty serious.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll remind everybody, I guess, of that comment I made earlier, because that's what really burned into my head, is when on the news, Prime Minister asked the parents to leave the room, and he gave a decent amount of time for that to happen, that awkward silence on TV. And then he addressed the kids. And I was like, this is like another level of weird. Like, that's some weird stuff going on. So that concern is where it adds that pressure. How do you deal with that? And where's that line in the sand for you? Like, and each individual person has to deal with that. And I think the guilt, if you know better, is that you might have crossed that line because you didn't know what the outcome was. And that's that social psychosis, formation psychosis, is a real thing. And I think that's what a lot of people were concerned about, not only with the past, but how easily that's able to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, especially now, I think it seems like it's more susceptible because you have all these other topics kind of coming up now too. It was COVID then, but now it's climate change. Now it's, pick a topic, really. I mean, it's just about any of it.
All the whatever manufactured crisis is of the day.
Seems like
that creates
what's around the corner. I don't know. Water. I mean,
selling a constant state of fear and anxiety.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. 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 That was more concerning to me than I didn't. I honestly wasn't that surprised that Justin Trudeau would do what he did, or that the federal government would do what they did, and then the provincial governments followed suit, because I knew exactly when he announced it, and along with the snap election, that it was about a wedge. It was a wedge issue to create division for the election. I was more shocked at how so many people just went along with it. And even shocked as well about, like, privately people would tell you that it was wrong, but they said and did nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That, we'll just leave that sit and soak in, I guess.
Well, I mean, I know I'm not alone in that. And I try. And I do have a level of compassion for people for choosing to remain silent, because I won't lie, it's been a rocky road being vocal, right? I think, I don't regret it. I think overall it was the right thing to do, but it's come with a cost for sure.
There's someone sent me this that kind of speaks to this topic here that I'd like to read. It's from Marcus Aurelius, who's warning in Meditations, where he talked about imperialization, about being stained purple and being Caesarified. The status quo doesn't like people who buck it. No, the status quo contrives to apply pressure and persuasion on us to get us to go along. Tries to change us, tries to lead us away from those pesky virtuous and courage and temperance and justice and wisdom. So let me reread that a little bit, because it didn't have flow. Tries to lead us away from those pesky virtues of courage and temperance and justice and wisdom. Mm-hmm. That's powerful. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm curious about that transition. Then you said, okay, this is at a point now where this isn't, you wanted to make a stand. You refused to get vaccinated for, a lot of the reasons that we had reviewed. What was that like, and how did that transition into now all of a sudden, some time later, in the bio, it said that was in December 2021, you kind of made your position known. And then the convoy was a few months later, or a couple months later. What was that transition like, and how did you get involved in the convoy and the role that you ended up actually falling into or becoming a part of?
Okay, so I'll just, before I left work, so it was right around Thanksgiving of that year, I had many conversations at work with colleagues and supervisors about my stand and what I saw happening and what I thought about the suppression of treatment and the vaccines not being safe and effective, and et cetera. And I had made my position clear that I wasn't taking it. And even when they wanted us to attest, like we had to fill out some kind of like basically declare whether we had taken it or not. And I refused to even do that. I said, like, let me be clear, like, you will get nothing from me. And so after they were reelected and they announced the official mandate right around Thanksgiving, I got sent home. And basically my two closest supervisors, like my sergeant and my staff sergeant, who were like, I was really close with, they both kind of like took me aside and said, look, like, we see what this is doing to you. Go take a month, figure out what you want to do, and let us know. So in that month, roughly, well, before the month was even up, I was already communicating with like other Mounties and other police officers that were facing similar things. I joined a couple groups. I ended up signing up for a lawsuit against the federal government. And we, the Mounties for Freedom group that existed at the time, wrote some open letters. One that was probably the most well-known one was like to the commissioner of the RCMP, like laying out our concerns about what was happening and even asking her to like initiate an investigation because we felt like there was criminal offenses had been committed, right? Like, you know, breach of trust, but also, in my opinion, you know, criminal negligence, crim neg causing death, you know, potentially worse. And, you know, we got like no response, zero. I emailed the commissioner later on, like directly just from me, no response. Prior to that, prior to the election, I had emailed my commanding officer, who was like an assistant commissioner at the time, like very, very experienced guy with lots of experience, like running big national security files. I tried to communicate with him and say, like, look, like, these are my concerns. These are the people I'm following. Like, I tried to keep it real concise because they don't have a lot of time, right? I'm like, here's a paragraph of my concerns. Here's a couple of links of like easy videos, like less than like 20, max 30-minute videos of these doctors.
Credible information.
Yeah, credible doctors talking about their concerns.
Yeah.
Radio silence, nothing. No response whatsoever. And the most that I got from a union rep was that they would help us navigate the being put on leave without pay. Right. I think some members were able to be helped with like medical or religious exemptions, but I don't know many. And a lot of people that I know that submitted got them sent back, and they had to get more.
They wanted follow-up information.
Yeah, right. They needed more. They needed to boost their rationale as to why they should be exempt. I only know a couple people that, like personally, that actually were successful with exemptions, but I didn't feel like I fell into either category at the time. So we, as a group of Mounties, we were like meeting and trying to figure out what we're going to do. Union's not going to fight for us. RCMP is just going to shove this on us, like, and not stand up to the Treasury Board or the feds at all. No one will even answer us. No one will communicate with us. So, well, we made the decision, well, someone has to speak out. Like
Yeah.
someone needs to be public. Like, so I was just at that point where I was kind of just like, F this, F them, I'm doing it.
Wow.
And,
You found that line and you had to cross over.
well, I had already come to the point where I felt like, okay, Canadians are dying because of what they're doing, whether it's being locked down, denied treatment, mental health related, increase, all the negative aspects that go along with all of the isolation and the mandates, refusing to let doctors treat people, intimidating doctors and nurses, and, with threat of losing their license and their job. So that's a criminal offense of intimidation, criminal negligence, causing death. And then you're forcing people to take something that, according to your own website on Health Canada, that is seriously injuring people, and people are even dying after taking it, more than
And they're ignoring any of those outcomes.
Well, they're certainly not talking about it.
Yeah.
Yet, obviously, according to their own reporting, they know there's an issue.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I'm sorry. To me, you're culpable of homicide. I'm a cop, or at the time I was. If I don't say something about this, I'll hate myself. Or I'll feel like a coward and I'll hate myself.
There will be guilt.
Yeah, there will be guilt, right? It's just no.
Shame, I guess, would be probably a better...
Shame, guilt. Our number one job as police is to protect and preserve life. And I know people would say, well, people are dying because of COVID. And I'm like, fair. There are people dying with COVID, maybe some people dying of COVID, but why aren't they being treated? So that, and what they were using. So for what I could tell for the longest time was if you weren't admitted to hospital, the advice was go home, hydrate, rest, maybe take some Tylenol or something, manage fever. Whereas, all the doctors we were following were saying if you hit early treatment right away, it drastically improves your chances of preventing it from getting hospitalized, preventing you from being hospitalized or worse. And then admitted to hospital for the longest time, it was remdesivir, which is a whole other topic, but I'm sure most of your listeners probably know that it's toxic. It's acknowledged by its own manufacturer to cause kidney and liver failure. And it certainly didn't seem, that was also kind of a fraudulent thing by Anthony Fauci, selling that to Trump as the antiviral solution to COVID.
But ivermectin is the wrong thing to be taken.
Even though it's got a better safety profile than asprin. Or anyways.
Sorry, I didn't mean to slide those
good.
little.
So all that to be said, it was ultimately I saw what I believe to be a multitude of criminal offenses being committed by our government, by our public health officials, and nobody in law enforcement was doing anything about it. And so my goal, the goal of us writing that letter to the commissioner, and then we wrote one to the attorney general, then another one as a Hail Mary pass to the governor general. Of course, we got no response from anybody. Why I spoke out publicly was because I was hoping that at the very least I would be able to be a face that a lot of people would know, people that I'd worked with in the north over the years that I had been a Mountie. I've been all over Canada, right? Here's someone that that hopefully you trust. I have your best interest in mind. This is what I see. And if you haven't look for yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm confident if you look, you will see what I see, right? You're all investigators, right? All these cops that I used to work with, it's you all started off as an investigator. no matter what you're doing now, that's how you all start off. It's like, if you go ahead, look at all the government information and what the mainstream media is pumping, and then look at all these people like the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, even just them in Canada. Like, I can guarantee you're going to find nothing but slogans and talking points over here and stupid analogies. And over here, you're going to find like subject matter experts that reference everything they say. And like, here's their they show their
like
work.
they're supposed to.
Yeah. Like these, they don't show any work over on official narrative side. Counter narrative side is like, these are all the studies that we're referencing. This is the work that we've done. Like, all the evidence is there, readily available. Anytime they do an analysis of like new stuff, it's, like the Pfizer documents, they make a whole documentary about it, about their whole analysis of it. It's like, I can almost guarantee you, if you look at it, if you actually look, like take the time and energy to look, you'll see what I'm saying and you'll get it and you'll know why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right. And some did, but not nearly as many as I was hoping.
It didn't produce any kind of real results.
Well, it didn't. I mean, I get naively, I was expecting some like tidal wave of like cops being like, this is bullshit. Like, you can't do this to people. And it didn't. And so anyway, that was like, I first started speaking in October. By November, I had made the decision to resign, told my boss, did all the paperwork for my resignation. December 15th, I officially resigned. Me and my wife were like, hey, you know what? Let's just hang out Christmas as a family, and then we're going to start getting our house ready to sell because we don't want to live in this community anymore. And then the convoy happened in January.
Okay, so what do you mean this community anymore?
Well, the town of Russell, where we were living.
You were going to move out of the town?
Well, yeah, I mean, we had pretty much decided that we were definitely leaving Russell.
And where were you going?
Well, Alberta.
Back to Alberta?
Alberta, or
because that's where the family, like your
yeah.
Okay.
Alberta, or leave the country.